in the relationship to God and the relationship to the beloved, the Sufi has the two opposites traditionally of fear and hope. And there is the hope for the journey, the hope for closeness to God. And that is by nature expansive. That it takes you into a bigger space than you were before. Now the Sufi actually says that hope should be balanced by fear, which is contractive by nature. And the fear is, for example, the fear of displeasing God, the fear of stepping off the path. And it is in my experience, it is something very, very deep within oneself. If you really want to make the journey back to God, there is this deep fear that you might not make it, that you might get sidetracked, that you might get waylaid, that the ego might take you. And so there is, the Sufi actually says, they are an important balance. If there's too much expansion, you get kind of carried away into this very expansive relationship with God, which can be a bit over the top. And then the fear brings you back. And what is interesting in Sufism traditionally is that opposite, as the journey progresses, becomes the next opposite, which is intimacy and awe. And these are, for the Sufi, these are two very different but very important relationships with God. The hope becomes intimacy, which is this incredible closeness you have with God. It is said, He is nearer to you than your very neck vein. And there is this very deep, personal, He is your beloved, your friend, this very intimate relationship to God. And then the Sufi says there has to be the opposite, which is awe. And the great Sufi Ibn al-Arabi said that the servant is always the servant, the Lord is always the Lord. And although there is this intimacy, there is another aspect in which He is beyond your idea of the beyond. He is so great, He is so eternal, all you can do is bow down. And that awe, which is really the awe of the Spirit towards the Almighty, is a very important balance to this very intimate, very personal relationship. And so the Sufis see these opposites, first of all fear and hope, that then the fear of God becomes awe for God, which is a slightly more elevated relationship. But it also, I always often feel in our culture, and maybe it's a reaction to the kind of hellfire Puritanism, we have lost an understanding of the tremendous power and almightiness of God. You know, He is actually, or she is actually God. You know, one of the sayings in the Lord's Prayer I've meditated on for many years, which is, "May Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And the Sufis, they actually have a different description of this. They say there is the world of divine command, rather than heaven, and the world of creation, which is the earth. And in the world of divine command, everything follows the will of God. That is actually the angelic plane also. Unlike human beings, angels bow down before God. They always do the will of God. And that is in the angelic kingdom, it works quite differently. I mean, there are incredibly beautiful angels of power and angels of beauty, but they follow the will of God. And in this world, we have choice, and somehow, and somehow this whole identification with us and individuality and choice, we have forgotten that He's actually the boss. And I have a feeling that maybe in the not too distant future, that aspect of the divine is going to make its presence felt again. There are times traditionally when the beloved withdraws, when God withdraws and we're allowed to make a mess of our life or to make something beautiful of our life. And there are also times when that almighty power makes its presence felt. Now I happen to have, in our tradition, we have a teacher-disciple relationship. And I have a teacher, my sheikh, who is an incredibly powerful spiritual being who is one with God. And when he comes, you don't argue. You don't negotiate, because that is really divine power that has tremendous authority, because it has the authority of God. And tremendous power. And you bow down before that, because it's completely impersonal. It is the will of God in this world. And I think that whether it's awe or fear, it is a natural reaction. You bow down before God. And somehow, I understand in our culture, in this importance of making an individual relationship with God, probably in reaction to the kind of hellfire preachings of a few centuries ago. Yes, it's wonderful to have this personal relationship with God, but we mustn't forget this other aspect. As Ibn al-Arabi says, He is always the Lord, you are always the servant, and you bow down before God. And there are times when you have to bow down quick. Otherwise, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. And when He says jump, you jump. And so that, whether it's fear or awe, it's important to recognize that relationship to God. Otherwise, we try to personalize it all too much. And it's very nice to have a personal relationship with God, but there's a time when He's not your friend, He's actually God. And that's why I often say that we've forgotten the world belongs to God. We think it belongs to us. And there's this nice line from Rumi when he says, maybe you should be like Noah and start an impossible project, a ridiculous project. And there are times when I think, hey, it's been a long time since He's actually made His presence felt. But who knows, it could be tomorrow. And part of my practice is always to be ready and attentive to that aspect of the divine. And that is, whether it's fear or awe, I think it's very, very healthy in spiritual practice.
What can we say about sacred politics and sacred economics, which is in the realm of the we rather than in the realm of the individual? I'm thinking of redistribution of wealth or of land, the idea of property. What's the higher teaching in terms of property and money and things of that ilk?
So I'm laughing because I must tell you a story that years and years ago, a young woman came to my teacher, Mrs. Tweedy, she was an old lady, and with a question about property. And she was really, concerned about whether she should buy or she should sell this house that she had, and what was the right spiritual attitude. And, my teacher, she'd taken this complete vow of poverty, which meant that she had to give away everything she had, and she had been left quite wealthy by her husband, and it all went to all sorts of different people. She came back to England, an elderly woman with a pension of 10 shillings a week, which was not a lot even in those days, in the 60s. And so somehow somebody coming to her for spiritual life and talking about a house, it just touched her in the wrong place. And what she said was, if you want to be on this path, you have to sell your house and you have to give the proceeds equally to everybody in the group. And because you don't know who's in the group and who isn't, you won't be able to do that. And it's like, she just kind of wiped the floor with that. Because, there are two things. One is, if you're interested in mystical life, in a real relationship with God that is unencumbered, you have to get rid of all attachments to everything. Even the idea of doing the right thing has to go, or especially the idea of doing the right thing, because there isn't a right thing. It's just being the servant. The servant doesn't do the right thing. The servant does what he's asked to do. Now that's one thing. Now then there is the bigger issue. Is there a role for a spiritual attitude in the broader economical, ecological, political place? Now, I passionately feel that if this culture is going to survive, if the civilization is, or if there is going to be a civilization that will survive, it has to be founded on spiritual principles, because that's what every other culture in the past, whether Native American or, for example, recently they discovered at Angkor Wat, that Angkor Wat was actually part of an enormous city about the size of Los Angeles, that was a spiritual city, that was made of temples and monks. Now just imagine Los Angeles as a spiritual city mainly of temples and monks. It is beyond our consciousness. We don't have that in our consciousness. And that we need to embrace the possibility that we can have a culture founded on spiritual principles. I call it oneness, because that's, to me, how it has to work. And I, for example, have friends who work in economics from that point of view, who are going around the world trying to bring that consciousness into it. Politics is a little bit more difficult. There was actually a very, very big joke which nobody in America got in the year 2000. Now, I don't know if you know, astrologically, the year 2000, this was the end of the Piscean era. And the Piscean era, according to Carl Jung, was the era of the warring brothers. And we were moving into a unity consciousness. Now, I don't know if you ever remember what happened at that election, but nobody won it. And it was such an important spiritual statement, and nobody got it. It was the end of that era of two people fighting. And it was such, I come from England, I wasn't allowed to vote, I watched it. I watched it with amazement, because the year 2000 is traditionally the beginning of the next era. And I watched this extraordinary symbolic happening play out on the political stage in America, and I laughed and then cried because nobody got it. The whole point is that the next era is not about people fighting each other, people against each other, is about us working together. But of course we don't have a system that can support anything except opposites, but opposites belong to the Piscean era, the two fishes. And of course if this world is going to survive, we have to move into unity consciousness, global awareness, and that means politically, economically, ecologically, on all those levels. How it's going to work out, well, I wait for the boss to decide, because human beings don't seem to be making much effort in that decision.
I suppose I was begging for some sense from you as to what the next steps would be.
Well, no, seriously, when I say waiting for the boss to decide, I am a mystic, and I actually believe in the will of God, because that is the only thing that really functions inside of me. And if I only do what I'm told to do, and I don't see why it just has to be the prerogative of the mystic. I really don't see why God can't come back into his world. And I don't see why there can't be some people who are going to be prepared to welcome him back into his world, and to welcome that consciousness, not just in heaven, but on earth. And all one has to do, traditionally, is to be receptive and to wait, so that if that happens, one is like Noah. And to me, how this is going to happen is, and I find very moving the way Father Keating's work is, small groups of people around the world coming together organically. There are going to be big organizations are a thing of the past. The future is not going to be decided by big organizations, companies, politicians, because when a system goes into crisis, it goes back to an organic level, because only on an organic level can life regenerate itself. And that is as much on the cellular level as on a spiritual level, and it's going to be small groups of people around the world connecting together, because that is the spiritual organism of life. And I find it very exciting, and I'm waiting for the next stage, which is actually how is it then going to happen? And what is very interesting is there is a stage on the individual journey when you reach a crisis point, when everything you do doesn't work. And in Sufism, it's called the stage of despair. It's a very, very important stage, and you have to reach it when all of your efforts don't work anymore. And only then do you surrender, and only then, traditionally, does the grace of God come and change the situation. And I don't see why, if it happens on an individual level, why the grace of God can't happen on a collective level. Because I think we've reached such a state and such a mess that we can't change it. But maybe the beloved can, maybe the boss can.
Within the context of oneness, as the sense of the other dissolves, does the I-thou relationship with God survive, or is that obliterated?
Yes, this is a very good question. Yeah. I don't think the I-thou, this is my opinion only, is completely dissolved in non-duality, but rather it becomes, how would I say this? I really can't say it. Perhaps you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean,
The thou is what God has called into existence, and entered into a relationship with us. In other words, we couldn't be a thou unless somebody called us to be thou. Otherwise, we'd be not there. But just to add one point for the sake of some clarification, the transforming union is the profound union of love between God and the soul, according to the mystics, and especially John of the Cross. And that is not just a passing experience or an ecstatic moment, but is, in John of the Cross's teaching, is a permanent state of consciousness where God is always present without our trying to make him present. I mean, the slightest loss of the presence of God can be immediately healed by just a thought or just a movement. Or God himself calls us back into the union if we start to forget temporarily. So it's a very advanced state and has generally been thought to be the ultimate term of the spiritual journey in the Christian tradition, and sometimes called bridal mysticism. So that the I-thou is not about self, but about the union of I and thou, or God and I. But notice there are still two. So it's not total non-duality, as is foreseen in some Eastern traditions like Advaita or Vedanta or Advaitic Hinduism. All I can say is having chatted with some of the Buddhist masters as well as Hindu teachers, they don't really mean that there is a complete loss of identity. In other words, no self at all. Though it feels like no self at all, according to those who have written on the subject. A person who has, as a Christian, who has claimed to experience this state is Bernadette Roberts, who has an interesting book on the experience of no self as a Christian. And she came to this without any dialogue with the Buddhist or Eastern traditions. So that the same journey, whatever it's called, is present in Christian mysticism, and I'm sure it's present in Sufi mysticism also. So, but I'm interested to hear what Llewellyn has to say about this, because Rumi and Hafiz and the other great lovers in the Sufi tradition are always talking about how much they, that is, I love God. And there seems to be a further state of unity in which one moves beyond the sense of an I loving God to just God. And I think this is what is included in the idea that there is no other. So it's practically, possibly too deep a subject for us to explore thoroughly tonight, and it would be good to sit down with teachers of other religions, because you're really talking about what is the ultimate spiritual experience that is possible in this life. Certainly for Christians, heaven is a place where there's both non-duality and the union of love. And in the Buddhist tradition, as at least among some of the teachers I've spoken to, no self doesn't mean a complete loss of identity or disappearing into God like a drop of water into the ocean, which is sometimes used as an image without perhaps too much distinction or caution. But it seems like, again, it's one of those paradoxes in which we say that God is not one, not two. In other words, you can't affirm the divine existence by any statement at all. In other words, you can only speak out of one side of your mouth at a time. And our mouth in this case is reason, which can only think in terms of opposites or of one side of an issue at one time. So it's only in going beyond that state of consciousness that the answer isn't exactly provided through rational reflection. But you withdraw the question, like in Job's case. He had terrible problems with God and God's justice because he suffered all kinds of things in a cultural time where suffering was considered the result of sin. And so when his comforters came and started saying, well, just acknowledge your sin and God will forgive you, he was too honest to do that. He was faithful to his own experience, and so he was prepared to call God to judgment and to demand of God why he was being treated in this way, because he knew he hadn't sinned or done anything wrong. So that's resolved not by an answer, but by God just showing up. So this is really the answer to every question. God. But not God in an abstract or conceptual form, or a profound experience of God being put into rational terminology, in which some of it is always lost by coming down to that level of contradiction. But the resolution of opposites is a characteristic of a kind of cosmic consciousness in which there's the oneness is predominant, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's still not an identity participating in this oneness. So at this point in my life, I think of that the ultimate state is both dual and non-dual. Mostly non-dual, but still there is a thou. And that's my best answer to your very good question. Please consult the experts for further details.
You want me to? Traditionally, there is this stage, whether you call it merging or dissolving or unio mystica, in which your individual consciousness dissolves, and you are taken onto whether you call it the plane of the self, which is a plane of complete oneness, and there are even states beyond that where there is no individual self. There's a lovely Sufi saying about being lost in the company of those who are lost in God. You are completely lost. There is nothing there. Traditionally, this is a state you have in meditation or prayer, which is maybe for an hour, maybe for a night, and then you come back again into this world. Now, there are people, not so many, who choose to remain in that state. There was the great Indian saint, in India there are particular saints like that. Amanda Ma, who couldn't even feed herself, never referred to herself as an individual person. She was looked after. She was completely in that unity state of consciousness with no awareness of an individual self. And saying that, but in Sufism, traditionally, you go into that state of unity consciousness, of merging in God, and then you come back again into this world. The Sufis say, particularly in our particular Sufi lineage, says that after the state of union with God is the state of servanthood. And you go into that state of oneness, you completely dissolve, you lose yourself. So it can be a meditation, it can be, it can last longer. For example, when my teacher, Irina Tweedy, when she finished, after her teacher died, she was completely in that state. She didn't, everything was God. The dog shit on the sidewalk was divine. She had no individual consciousness. She actually had to go to an ashram in the Himalayas for 6 months for there to be some individual consciousness to come back. And even then there were times when she lived in London, for example, she went to the post office and she forgot what her name was to write on, to write on the letter. She didn't know her way back home. She forgot who she was. So that consciousness remained. It's actually very difficult to live in that state of consciousness in the West. So traditionally what happens, there is a state in Sufism called abiding after passing away. And something comes back. 80% of you remains merged in oneness. But part of the ego comes back to enable you to live in this world. And that is the servant that has a relationship that is because, he is always Lord, you are always servant, that is here to be in service. It's a very, very difficult time of transition. And part of you at that time wants to go completely because there it is so beautiful. Those planes of oneness, the emptiness, it is so beautiful. This world is very constricted, very limited, and you have problems, you have an identity. It is, once you've experienced, for example, what it's like not to exist, once you've gone into non-existence, and once you've experienced what it's like not to exist, to come back to existence is very painful, it's very difficult, because it's so ridiculous, it's so petty, it's so small, it has problems, it gets backache, it can get a speeding ticket. It exists, but traditionally, in order to do a certain spiritual work in the world, unless you're one of these Indian saints, there needs to be an ego, there needs to be a sense of self. And so something remains. But there's actually one of the great Sufis, Junaid, he actually said in that state there's a very difficult tension between the part of you that doesn't exist, the part of you that is merged, and the part of you that has to exist in order to be here in this world. It's not very understood, but it is a different state of consciousness. You have to learn how to be in it. Sometimes you have to use a lot of will to force yourself into existence, because there's this tremendous pull into non-existence, into being completely lost in God.
So is that state pantheism?
No, no pantheism. You have an ego to be of service in this world because...
But in that altered state, when you were emerged, you said that she saw everything as God.
Everything is God. But everything is God. Of course everything is God. How can anything not be God? But normally, we don't live in that. We have veils. For example, you try and go to the supermarket when you're in that state. You can't choose anything. You walk out. There is nobody there to choose anything. And you can't compute any differences. Everybody is the same. Everybody is divine. There is no difference. You cannot live. She had to go for 6 months to the Himalayas, and then her consciousness reformed. This is what actually happens. The consciousness reforms around either an awareness of unity or an awareness of non-existence. And the ego then makes a relationship. I wrote about it in, I think, one of my books called Circle of Love. The ego then makes a relationship to the fact that it doesn't exist. It's a very difficult transition when you actually know you don't exist, and at the same time you have to pretend to exist. And as I say, Junaid calls this abiding after passing away. It's a classic stage on the Sufi path. And you do exist, so there is a relationship. You are in service to that within you that is merged in God.
Could I ask for a clarification?
Yeah.
Am I on the air?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you say from the classic Sufi teaching that there always remains a distinction, not individual self, but a distinction as a creature from God?
Yes.
Even in unity consciousness,
Well,
so that one doesn't totally dissolve.
No, there are states in which you totally dissolve. There is no individual consciousness, but there's a whole argument actually in Sufism. some Sufis say you shouldn't stay in those states. For example, there was a great Sufi, Bayezid Bistami, and he used to go into those states, and then he would say heretical things like, under my cloak there is only God. And when he came out of those states, he was horrified that he had said such a heretical thing. But there is an allowance given that when you are in the state of divine intoxication, when there is no individual consciousness, and you are just, the individual consciousness is merged into the universal consciousness, or you are completely one with God, that you are then actually given allowances to saying such things. But normally, then you come back. And in fact, when he came back into this world, he said to his disciples, if I do that again, take out your daggers and kill me, because I'm being heretical. And the story goes that, of course, he went into another state of divine intoxication, and they took out their daggers to kill him, but they found they were only hurting themselves.
Well, you're describing several people who were in and out of this state. I'm talking about whether it can be a permanent state in this life. I don't think in Christian mystics think it could be permanent, but you might have a period of ecstatic experience like you described.
I think it's very
But what do they say among the Sufis about a permanent state of no self? That is to say, unity consciousness.
Yeah, it is not advised. No, seriously. That is, it's seriously because...
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a very pleasant state to me.
Well,
it?
It is wonderful. You're not there. You don't mind. There is no seriously, there is no self, there is no time, there is no space, there is no self. There is just bliss, there is just oneness, there is just love. But to function in this world, in that state, it is fine if you're in an ashram, if you're in a monastery, the door's closed. You can be like that for weeks. And
not in my monastery. We're talking about some fairly refined territory here, but since this gentleman was kind enough to bring it up, there is in the Beguine tradition that is the Rhineland mystics, just prior to Eckhart, and they may have influenced him, who were very advanced contemplative lay women mostly. There were some men in the movement. It was kind of a unstructured thing. They sometimes lived together, sometimes different. But Hedewig has some extraordinary poems. Yeah. And in one of her sayings, she clearly says that beyond transforming union and bridal mysticism that she had experienced, that the transforming union is itself initiates a further stage of spiritual growth that ends or terminates through some dark nights, by the way, in unity consciousness, which she describes in one of her poems as giving up love for love's sake.
Yeah, that is true.
Is that
is
reflected in the
that is in Sufism too. It is, yeah, the complete surrender.
In other words, love isn't just bliss.
No.
It can be sacrificed for a greater love,
yeah.
Namely the redemption of the human family. And this is really what the bodhisattva is in Buddhism.
Yeah, this is the same. This is the same as servanthood in Sufism.
Yes.
And it's said that the lover has to even give up the fruits of samadhi, of higher consciousness.
Yes.
You are just here in service to God.
So there is this state beyond.
Yes. Beyond union with God, there is a state of servanthood, of coming back like a bodhisattva to be of service in this world.
Could you please comment on what's the best way to honor the femininity of God, and how can we bring the balance of the masculine and the femininity into focus?
I should explain that my teacher, who I studied with until she died in 1999, Irina Tweedy, she was trained by a Sufi master in India, and after he died, she came back to the West. And he asked her to do two things. And he asked her to bring the feminine into Sufism and into the West. And he also asked her to bring together Christianity and Sufism. Now what's very moving is actually she was a very powerful woman and in her own right, and she brought the feminine into Sufism, into the way she taught, into the way we were with her. But she said because she'd had a bad experience with the Catholic Church when she was young, she found it very difficult to bring Christianity and Sufism together, and she asked me to do that. And this meeting is like a confirmation of that, of bringing together Christianity and Sufism. But out of that work that she was asked to do about bringing the feminine in Sufism to the West, I actually developed, with the help of my wife Annette, I developed a whole body of teachings on the feminine in spirituality. We had recently, just a couple of months ago, we have a website, workingwithoneness.org, and we put a whole thing on all of these teachings to do with the feminine and to do with reclaiming the feminine, and also what has moved me very recently is reclaiming the relationship with the anima mundi, the soul of the world, which is this feminine divine presence within creation, and which is very, very important to make that relationship to help the world at this time of transition. So, I mean, I could, talk for a long time about it, but I won't. But I just say there is this body of work that has been given to me, so it's available there. Yeah.
How do you feel that we, as instruments of oneness, can function best?
Why not trust oneness? If oneness is divine, and we are all part of this divine being that is oneness, all that matters is that you show up, and that you show up and you make a commitment to oneness. Because if oneness actually exists, what is going to change our world is not you or me, it is the oneness. And it is to, I'm a mystic, so we don't expect to know what we are doing. I do not ask to see, I do not ask to know, I ask only to be used. And through the grace of God, maybe one is used, or maybe one isn't, because one is not of much use at the moment, maybe later on. But if you believe in oneness, and oneness as an expression of the divine, my sense is the divine knows what to do. And I don't mean an abstract divine, I mean a divine presence. I, for example, feel this world is infinitely wise. It has been through cataclysms before. Why not learn to listen? Why not learn to be receptive? And maybe life or the beloved, and I don't know if there's a difference, will tell you where it needs you to be. Because it is, again, the Sufis say it is the consent that draws down the grace. If you say, yes, beloved, use me. Yes, divine oneness, I am a part of you. I recognize that. And you offer yourself to that spiritual being that is oneness. To me, that is what can change. And whether you get taken into politics or whether you get taken into your back garden, doesn't really matter. It is like, Mother Teresa, when she said small things with great love, it's not what you do, it's the love you put in the doing, because then you give it to God and He makes it infinite. There is this extraordinary whole of which we are a part. And to me, all the problems in our culture come from separation, come from alienation, separation from each other, separation from the world, and on an even more primal level, a consciousness that has become separate from God. And if we can affirm that we are part of this oneness can heal the world, this oneness can change life. We can't. And all I would say is doing spiritual practice. Maybe one is prepared a little more for that than other people, because you can't change yourself. You have no idea what to do. So you pray, so you surrender, so you ask, so you say, beloved, do with me what thou willst. And most of us have experienced the miracle that happens, which is a response to that. Otherwise we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be spending a Saturday afternoon here, we'd be at the shopping mall. And it is returning everything to God, which is the oneness, which is life. And in a way, all I would say, and this actually answers one of the questions about the feminine, is also to redeem this split between heaven and earth. There was a reason for it, yes. The last era was an era of separation. There was a reason to realize the transcendent aspect of the divinity, yes. There was a reason for this patriarchal era, but that is over now. And just as we need to heal the split between masculine and feminine, we need to heal the split between spirit and matter, heaven and earth. And if we do that in our daily practice, we do it for the whole world. We can do that. That we can do.